The notification sound from my phone barely registered above the chaos of baggage claim at JFK International Airport. I glanced down at the screen, expecting confirmation that my ride was waiting outside. Instead, I found a group chat message from my sister Claire that made my blood run cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sorry, Maya. Emergency came up with Brad's presentation tomorrow. Can't pick you up. Take an Uber. 3 years. 3 years since I'd been back home to New York, and this was the welcome I received. Not even a phone call, just a casual text dropped into our family group chat like I was an afterthought. I stood there in the middle of the crowded terminal, my designer luggage at my feet, watching families reunite with tears of joy while I processed what had just happened. My hands trembling slightly, I scrolled up through the chat history. There, it was, in black and white. 2 weeks ago, I'd sent a detailed message with my flight information. Flight 447 from San Francisco, arriving Thursday at 4:30 p.m. Can't wait to see everyone. The responses had been enthusiastic. Heart emojis from my mother. Can't wait, sis, from Claire, and even a rare, looking forward to it, from my usually stoic father. But here I was, standing alone while other passengers wheeled their bags toward waiting loved ones, and my family had simply forgotten about me. No, that wasn't quite right. They hadn't forgotten. They had actively chosen to prioritize something else. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Maya Chen, though I went by Maya Rodriguez professionally to avoid the assumptions that came with my mixed heritage, standing abandoned in an airport by the very people who had spent years lecturing me about family loyalty and responsibility. The same people who had no idea that the daughter they'd dismissed as a dreamer and too ambitious for her own good had just spent the last 3 years building something extraordinary. I pulled my phone out again and opened my banking app, a habit I'd developed over the past few months as the numbers had grown beyond anything I'd ever imagined. The balance stared back at me. $127,000. $127 million. The result of selling my AI marketing platform, Nexus Analytics, to a consortium of investors just 6 weeks ago. Money that my family knew nothing about because they'd never bothered to ask what I was actually building out in San Francisco. The taxi line stretched endlessly in front of me, a sea of yellow cabs and black cars waiting to ferry disappointed passengers like myself into the city. I'd been planning this trip for months, carefully coordinating with work schedules and client meetings to carve out 2 weeks to spend with my family, 2 weeks to finally share my success, to show them that their constant criticism and lack of support hadn't broken me, but had actually fueled something incredible. Instead, here I was, abandoned because my brother-in-law Brad's work presentation was apparently more important than picking up their daughter and sister who hadn't been home in 3 years. I thought about calling an Uber, the easy solution Claire had so casually suggested. Pull up the app, request a ride, pretend this betrayal hadn't happened, and show up at their door with a smile plastered on my face. That's what the old Maya would have done. The Maya who had spent her entire childhood and young adulthood apologizing for her ambitions, making herself smaller to avoid conflict, accepting whatever scraps of attention her family threw her way. But something had changed in those 3 years in San Francisco. Building a company from nothing, managing teams, negotiating with investors, presenting to boards of directors. Those experiences had forged a different version of myself, a version that didn't accept being treated as an afterthought. I pulled my laptop out of my carry-on bag and found a quiet corner near the windows overlooking the tarmac. The irony of what I was about to do from an airport floor wasn't lost on me. Some of the most important business decisions in history had probably been made in places just like this, in moments of clarity when conventional thinking got stripped away and only pure logic remained. My fingers moved across the keyboard, with practiced efficiency as I pulled up the research I'd been conducting for the past 2 months. Rodriguez Construction and Development, my father's company, the business that had been his pride and joy for the past 25 years, the company that employed my sister Claire as head of marketing and my brother-in-law Brad as project manager, the company that had provided the comfortable lifestyle my family enjoyed, their beautiful house in Westchester, their luxury cars, their annual vacations to Europe. The company that was, according to my extensive due diligence, in serious financial trouble. I'd started researching Rodriguez Construction not out of malice, but out of genuine concern. During our infrequent phone calls over the past year, my father had mentioned some challenging projects, some clients who were slow to pay, some unexpected cost overruns. Being in tech had taught me to read between the lines of corporate speak, and what I heard in his voice was stress. So I'd done what I always did when I was worried about something I'd investigated. Public records, financial filings, industry, reports, competitor analysis. What I'd found had shocked me. Rodriguez Construction was hemorrhaging money. They'd taken on several large projects that had gone significantly over budget. Their cash flow was negative. They'd maxed out their lines of credit. And based on the timeline I'd constructed, they had maybe 6 months before they'd be forced to declare bankruptcy. 6 months before my father lost everything he'd built over more than 2 decades. The research had been sitting in a folder on my laptop for weeks, waiting for this trip home when I planned to sit down with my father and offer to help. Maybe bring in some of my network to provide financial consulting. Maybe even make a direct investment to help stabilize the company. I'd imagined the conversation, the gratitude in his eyes when he realized his daughter had become successful enough to help save the family business. But sitting here on the cold airport floor, forgotten and dismissed, a different kind of conversation was taking shape in my mind. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the website of Morrison & Associates, the boutique investment firm I'd worked with during my own company's sale. David Morrison had been mentioning for months that his clients were looking for good acquisition opportunities in the construction sector. Lots of family businesses struggling to modernize, he'd said during our last conversation. Prime opportunities for investors who know how to see potential. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Once I made this call, there would be no going back. This wasn't just about buying a company. This was about fundamentally altering the power dynamic in my family, about making a statement that would echo for years to come. I thought about all the times my parents had introduced me to their friends as, "Our daughter Maya, she's out in California doing some computer thing." The dismissive tone, the subtle suggestion that my work wasn't quite real or important. I thought about the countless family dinners where my achievements were glossed over while my siblings' far more modest accomplishments were celebrated extensively. I thought about my college graduation, where my parents had spent the entire day talking about Claire's new job at a local marketing firm, while barely acknowledging that I'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science from Stanford. I thought about the night I'd called to tell them about getting my first major client for Nexus Analytics, only to have my mother cut the conversation short because she was watching her favorite TV show. I thought about Christmas 2 years ago, the last time I'd been home, when my father had suggested I should consider coming back to New York and finding a more stable career, perhaps something in teaching or administration. "This tech startup thing is nice as a hobby," he'd said, "but at some point you need to think about your future security." My future security. I almost laughed out loud remembering that conversation now, sitting here with more money in my bank account than my father would see in 10 lifetimes. I dialed David Morrison's direct line. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that smooth confidence that came from decades of making deals that changed people's lives. "Maya, wonderful to hear from you. How are you enjoying your newfound freedom from the corporate grind?" "Actually, David, I'm calling about a potential investment opportunity. Are you still looking for construction companies for your clients?" "Always." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What do you have in mind? I took a deep breath, watching a plane taxi past the window as I prepared to say the words that would change everything. Rodriguez Construction and Development. New York-based, 25 years in business. Currently, facing some financial challenges that create an excellent acquisition opportunity. Rodriguez? David mused, and I could hear him typing in the background. Any relation to you? I know your professional name is Rodriguez. It's my father's company. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. David Morrison hadn't built his reputation by making impulsive decisions, but he also hadn't built it by missing opportunities when they presented themselves. That's interesting, he finally said. Family dynamics aside, what's the business case? For the next 20 minutes, I walked him through my analysis. The company's assets, its client relationships, its reputation in the New York construction market. The financial challenges that were creating the acquisition opportunity. The potential for operational improvements and modernization that could return the company to profitability within 18 months. The fundamentals are solid, I explained, my voice steady despite the emotional magnitude of what I was proposing. The current management has made some strategic errors, but nothing that can't be corrected with proper oversight and capital injection. And you want to be the acquiring party? I want to structure it as an acquisition by Morrison and Associates, with me as the primary investor and operational director. Full management control, with the current leadership team reporting to me. Another pause. Maya, I have to ask, is this about business or is this personal? The question hung in the air between us. I watched another family reunion happening near the baggage carousel. A young man surprising his parents with an unexpected homecoming, their faces lighting up with joy and tears. It's about both, I said finally. But the business case stands on its own merits. Check the numbers, David. This is a good investment regardless of the family connection. I'll need 48 hours to run our due diligence. I need a decision by tomorrow afternoon. That's aggressive even for you. The seller doesn't know they're going to be selling yet, but they will by tomorrow evening when I sit down with them to discuss their options. They can either accept our acquisition offer, or they can wait 6 months and file for bankruptcy. I'm trying to give them the more pleasant alternative. I could hear David's chair creaking as he leaned back, processing the implications of what I was telling him. You're going to present this as a fait accompli? I'm going to present this as a solution to a problem they don't yet realize they have. Maya? David's voice carried a note of concern. I've seen family business acquisitions go sideways in ways that destroy relationships permanently. Are you prepared for that possibility? I looked around the airport again, at the crowds of people hurrying to catch flights, to meet loved ones, to begin journeys. Everyone here had somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. Everyone except me. David, my family forgot to pick me up at the airport. They've been taking me for granted my entire life. Maybe it's time they learned that actions have consequences. All right, he said, and I could hear the decision crystallizing in his voice. Send me everything you have. I'll put my best team on this tonight. If the numbers work, we'll have an offer ready by tomorrow afternoon. One more thing, I added. I want this structured so that I maintain voting control. This isn't just an investment for me. This is about taking operational control of the company. Understood. Maya? Yes? I hope you know what you're doing. After I hung up, I sat in that airport corner for another hour, uploading files and documents to Morrison's secure server. My complete financial analysis of Rodriguez Construction, industry comparisons, projected improvement scenarios, asset valuations, everything they would need to make the acquisition happen. As I worked, I thought about the conversation I would have with my family tomorrow evening. I'd originally planned to surprise them with news of my success, to finally receive the recognition and respect I'd been seeking my entire life. Now I would surprise them with something entirely different. I would walk into their comfortable house, the house that would soon be owned by my company, and I would sit down in their living room, the living room where I'd endured countless lectures about responsibility and practicality and thinking about my future, and I would explain to them that their daughter, the one they'd dismissed and forgotten, was now their boss. The taxi line had shortened considerably by the time I finally packed up my laptop and walked outside. The sun was setting over Queens, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reminded me of the San Francisco sunsets I'd grown to love. The driver who picked me up was a middle-aged man named Carlos, who tried to make conversation during the ride into Manhattan. "First time in New York?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "No," I replied, watching the familiar skyline grow larger as we crossed the Queensboro Bridge. "I'm coming home." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't quite true. The woman getting out of this taxi would be different from the one who had left New York 3 years ago. That woman had been seeking approval, desperate to prove herself worthy of her family's love and respect. This woman already knew her worth, and she was about to teach her family a lesson they would never forget. My phone buzzed with another message in the family group chat. My mother this time. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow evening. Dinner at 7 p.m. sharp. Dad's making his famous paella." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed my response. "Looking forward to it. I have some exciting news to share. With everyone." That was an understatement. By tomorrow evening, I would own Rodriguez Construction and Development. By tomorrow evening, my father would be working for me. By tomorrow evening, my family would understand exactly how much their dismissal and neglect had cost them. As the taxi pulled up to my hotel in Midtown Manhattan, I thought about the last conversation I'd had with my grandmother before she passed, away 2 years ago. Abuela Maria had been the only member of my family who had truly understood my ambitions, who had encouraged me to dream bigger and reach further. "Mija," she had whispered to me in her hospital bed, her weathered hands holding mine with surprising strength. Sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones who see us the least clearly. They love who they think we are, not who we really are. But you know who you are. Don't let anyone make you smaller than that. I had carried those words with me through every challenge, every late night, every moment of doubt as I built Nexus Analytics from an idea into a revolutionary platform that companies around the world now relied on for their marketing strategies. I had carried them through the negotiations for my company's sale, through the surreal experience of watching my bank account balance grow by 8 figures overnight. And I would carry them tomorrow, when I sat down with my family and showed them exactly who I really was. The hotel room was on the 34th floor, with windows facing west toward the Hudson River. I ordered room service and spread my laptop and documents across the king-sized bed, preparing for what would likely be a sleepless night of final preparations. David Morrison's team worked with impressive efficiency. By midnight, I had preliminary acquisition terms in my email. By 2 a.m., we had refined the structure to give me maximum operational control while minimizing regulatory complexity. By 4 a.m., we had a comprehensive offer packet ready to present. Rodriguez Construction and Development would be acquired by Morrison and Associates for $12 million, with Maya Rodriguez as operational director and majority stakeholder. The current ownership would retain a minority stake and consulting roles, but all major decisions would require my approval. My father would transition from owner to employee, with his compensation tied to the company's improved performance under my leadership. It was a generous offer, far more generous than they would receive from any other potential buyer, and certainly more than they would recover in a bankruptcy scenario. But generosity wasn't the point. Control was the point. As dawn broke over Manhattan, I finally allowed myself to think about the emotional implications of what I was about to do. Was this revenge? Was this justice? Was this simply the natural consequence of years of being undervalued and dismissed? Maybe it was all three. I thought about calling David and backing out, returning to my original plan of simply offering to help save the company as a loving daughter. But then I remembered sitting on that airport floor, reading Claire's casual dismissal of my homecoming, feeling the familiar sting of being treated as an afterthought. No, this was the right choice. This was the necessary choice. My family had spent years teaching me that I didn't matter, that my dreams and ambitions were secondary to everyone else's immediate needs and preferences. Tomorrow evening, they would learn the cost of that lesson. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing a conservative navy business suit that projected authority without ostentation. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful executive, about to make a business proposition. The Uber ride to Westchester took 45 minutes through afternoon traffic. As we drove through increasingly familiar neighborhoods, I found myself cataloging all the changes since my last visit. New developments, updated storefronts, the gradual modernization of the suburban landscape where I'd grown up. But some things remained exactly the same. The tree-lined street where my parents lived, the well-maintained lawns and colonial-style houses that spoke of comfortable middle-class prosperity, the sense of stability and tradition that had once felt comforting but now seemed almost quaint. After 3 years in the dynamic, constantly evolving world of Silicon Valley, I paid the driver and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in front of the house where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life. The white columns and red brick facade looked exactly as they had when I'd left for Stanford, exactly as they had in all my childhood memories. But everything else was about to change. I walked up the familiar path and rang the doorbell, my briefcase heavy with documents that would reshape my family's future. Through the frosted glass, I could see someone approaching the door. This was it. The moment when Maya Rodriguez, the forgotten daughter, would become Maya Rodriguez, the woman who owned her father's company. The door opened and my mother's face appeared, her expression transforming from curiosity to delight as she recognized me. "Maya!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a warm embrace. "You look wonderful. How was your flight? I'm so sorry about yesterday." Claire felt terrible about the mix-up. Mix-up? That's what they were calling it now. "It's fine, Mom," I said, returning her hug while mentally preparing for the conversation that would follow dinner. It actually gave me time to take care of some business. "Always working," she said with a fond shake of her head. Come in. Everyone's in the living room. Your father's been so excited to see you." As I followed her into the house, I thought about how this same living room would look tomorrow, when my father realized that his daughter now controlled his company's future. When Claire understood that her casual dismissal of my arrival had cost her family their independence. When they all learned that the daughter they'd underestimated had been quietly building the power to change their lives forever. Tonight would be our last dinner as the family we'd always been. Tomorrow, we would begin the complex process of becoming something entirely different. The familiar scent of my mother's cooking filled the house as I stepped through the front door, a mixture of saffron and garlic that transported me instantly back to childhood Sunday dinners. But now, instead of comfort, it brought a sharp awareness of how this house would soon become part of my business portfolio rather than simply the place I'd grown up. "Maya!" My father's voice boomed from the living room, and I could hear his heavy footsteps approaching. Roberto Rodriguez appeared in the hallway, his arms spread wide for one of his characteristic bear hugs. At 58, he still carried himself with the confident bearing of a man who had built something from nothing, though I noticed new lines around his eyes and a slight stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there during my last visit. "There's my brilliant daughter," he said, squeezing me tightly, "the tech genius of the family." The words were warm, but I caught the subtle condescension in his tone. Tech genius, as if my work was some kind of parlor trick rather than a legitimate business accomplishment. It was the same tone he'd used when I was 12 and built my first computer from spare parts. Impressive in a novelty sort of way, but not quite real. "Hi, Dad," I said, allowing myself to enjoy the hug while mentally cataloging how different our next embrace would be after he learned that his tech genius daughter now controlled his company's fate. Claire emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. My older sister looked exactly as I remembered her, perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of effortless elegance that had always made me feel slightly underdressed in comparison. Behind her came Brad, her husband of 6 years, a man whose defining characteristic seemed to be his ability to agree enthusiastically with whatever opinion had been expressed most recently. "Maya!" Claire rushed over for her own hug, though I noticed she was careful not to disturb her makeup. I felt so terrible about yesterday. Brad's presentation got moved up at the last minute, and it was such chaos. "The Morrison account," Brad added importantly, as if I should know what that meant. "Huge potential for the agency. Could really put us on the map." I almost smiled at the irony. Brad worked for a mid-sized marketing firm that served local businesses, the kind of regional operation that would be considered quaint by Silicon Valley standards. His biggest client presentation probably involved a budget smaller than what I'd spent on office furniture for Nexus Analytics. But to him, it was the center of the universe, important enough to abandon his sister-in-law at the airport. "Of course," I said smoothly. "Family emergencies happen." Claire looked relieved, clearly interpreting my calm response as forgiveness. She had no idea that I was already planning how I would restructure the marketing department at Rodriguez. Construction? Or whether I would even keep her in her current role once the acquisition was complete. "Come sit," my mother called from the kitchen. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Maya, tell us everything about San Francisco. Are you still working for that startup?" I settled into the familiar living room, noting how everything was exactly as I'd left it 3 years ago. The same beige sectional sofa, the same coffee table with its carefully arranged magazines, the same family photos on the mantel. Photos that told the story of our family's priorities with brutal clarity. There was Claire's high school graduation, prominently displayed in an ornate silver frame, her college graduation in an equally expensive frame. Her wedding photo, professional and elaborate, taking up prime real estate on the center of the mantel. Brad's MBA graduation had earned its own spot, along with several photos of their various vacations and achievements. My own photos were there, too, but relegated to the sides and back. My high school graduation in a simple drugstore frame. My Stanford graduation photo tucked behind Claire's wedding picture, barely visible unless you were specifically looking for it. No photos of any of my professional accomplishments, because my family had never bothered to attend any events where such photos might have been taken. "I'm not working for a startup anymore," I said, settling back into the cushions. "I sold my company 6 weeks ago." The casual way I delivered this information seemed to momentarily stun them into silence. My father's eyebrows rose slightly, my mother paused in her kitchen preparations, and Claire exchanged a glance with Brad. "Sold it?" my father asked. "For how much?" I had prepared for this question, knowing it would be the first thing they asked. Not congratulations on the achievement, not curiosity about what I had built or how I had built it, but an immediate focus on the monetary value. "Enough to be comfortable," I replied vaguely. It was a good outcome for everyone involved. The truth was that the sale had made me one of the wealthiest women under 30 in the country, but they weren't ready for that information yet. Tonight was about re-establishing relationships and gathering intelligence. Tomorrow would be about reshaping power dynamics. "That's wonderful, sweetie," my mother said, though her tone suggested she wasn't quite sure how wonderful it actually was. "What kind of company was it again?" This question encapsulated everything about my relationship with my family. For 3 years, I had been building Nexus Analytics, regularly updating them on our progress during our monthly phone calls, I had explained our technology, our clients, our growth trajectory. But none of them had really listened, treating my professional life as background noise to be politely acknowledged before moving on to more interesting topics. We developed artificial intelligence for marketing optimization, I explained patiently. Our platform helped companies personalize their customer communications at scale. Fortune 500 companies used our technology to increase their conversion rates by an average of 37%. That sounds very technical, Brad said, in the tone people use when they want to sound interested but have no intention of actually engaging with the subject matter. It was, I agreed, but also very profitable. We had clients in 15 countries by the time we sold. 15 countries, my father repeated, and I could see him trying to process what that might mean in terms of revenue and scale. Roberto Rodriguez was a smart man, and despite his limited understanding of technology, he understood business fundamentals. A company operating in 15 countries represented significant success. Maya's always been so driven, my mother said, from the kitchen, her voice carrying that mixture of pride and concern that had characterized her attitude toward my ambitions for as long as I could remember. Sometimes I worry you work too hard, mija. When are you going to settle down? Maybe think about starting a family. And there it was, the inevitable pivot from my professional accomplishments to my personal shortcomings. In my mother's worldview, no amount of business success could compensate for the fact that I was 28 years old and still single. The irony was that I had actually been in a serious relationship for the past year and a half, with another tech entrepreneur named James who understood my work and supported my ambitions. But I had learned long ago not to share personal information with my family until relationships were permanent, because they had a way of turning every dating update into evidence that I was prioritizing my career over my happiness. I'm happy with my life as it is, I said simply. But don't you want children someday? Claire interjected. You're not getting any younger, and the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. Claire had been married at 24 and had been trying to get pregnant for the past 2 years without success, a struggle that had made her increasingly invested in other people's reproductive timelines. Her concern was genuine, but it was also loaded with assumptions about what constituted a fulfilling life for a woman. I'm not ruling anything out, I replied. But right now, I'm focused on my next professional challenge. Which is what? My father asked, leaning forward with what seemed like genuine interest. This was the opening I had been waiting for. I'm looking into investment opportunities, specifically companies that have strong fundamentals but are facing temporary financial challenges. I watched my father's face carefully as I said this, looking for any sign that he might be thinking about his own company's situation. But Roberto Rodriguez was an excellent poker player, and his expression revealed nothing. Real estate? He asked. Various sectors. Construction and development is particularly interesting right now. There are a lot of established companies that are struggling with cash flow issues because of changes in the market, but that have valuable assets and client relationships. Again, no visible reaction from my father. Either he was better at hiding his concerns than I had expected, or he genuinely didn't realize how precarious his company's financial position had become. The conversation was interrupted by my mother calling us to dinner. We moved to the dining room, where she had set the table with her good china and lit candles. The paella was spectacular, as always, rich with seafood and perfectly seasoned. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect homecoming meal. But as we ate, I found myself studying my family with new eyes, seeing them not just as the people who had raised me, but as the people who would soon be learning that their futures depended on my goodwill. My father dominated the conversation, as he always did, regaling us with stories from various construction projects. He spoke with passion about a new office complex his company was building downtown, the challenges of working in a constrained urban environment, the satisfaction of creating something permanent and meaningful. There's nothing like seeing a Building rise from an empty lot, he said, gesturing with his fork. Knowing that families will live there or businesses will operate there for decades to come. It's legacy work. I could hear the pride in his voice, the deep satisfaction he derived from his profession. Roberto Rodriguez genuinely loved what he did, and he was good at it. His company had an excellent reputation for quality and reliability. But love and skill weren't enough to overcome poor financial management and an increasingly competitive market. "How's business generally?" I asked, trying to sound like a curious daughter rather than a potential investor conducting due diligence. Good, he replied automatically. "Always challenges, but we're managing. The market is tough right now, lots of competition, but we have a strong client base." Claire nodded enthusiastically. "Dad's company is so well regarded. The marketing practically writes itself when you have that kind of reputation." I wondered if Claire actually understood the company's financial situation, or if she was as oblivious as she seemed. As head of marketing, she should have been aware of declining revenues and cash flow problems. But it was possible that my father had been shielding the family from the full extent of their difficulties. "What about that big project you mentioned last time we talked?" I asked. "The one that was running over budget?" For the first time all evening, I saw a flicker of something cross my father's face. Concern, maybe, or frustration. "We're working through some challenges," he said carefully. "The client made some significant changes to the original specifications, and we're negotiating additional compensation. It's all part of the business." But his tone suggested it was more complicated than he was letting on. I made a mental note to review the details of that project in my research files. It was likely one of the major factors contributing to the company's current financial stress. Brad, apparently sensing an opportunity to contribute to the conversation, launched into a story about his own workplace challenges. Something about a difficult client and a campaign that wasn't performing as expected. I listened politely while privately marveling at the difference in scale between his problems and mine. 6 weeks ago, I had been managing a team of 87 people across 4 offices, with quarterly revenues larger than his entire company's annual billings. After dinner, we moved back to the living room for coffee and dessert. My mother had made flan, another family favorite that brought back memories of birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings. The conversation turned to family news, updates on relatives and family friends that I had lost touch with during my years in California. "Your cousin Miguel got promoted to partner at his law firm," my mother reported. "And remember the Hernandez family from down the street? Their daughter just got accepted to medical school." This was another familiar family dynamic, the way my mother used other people's achievements as gentle pressure for me to conform to more conventional success metrics. Being a partner at a law firm or getting into medical school were accomplishments she could understand and explain to her friends. Selling a tech company for 9 figures was more difficult to categorize and therefore less satisfying to brag about. "That's wonderful for them," I said sincerely. I had no animosity toward my relatives or family friends. Their successes didn't diminish mine, and mine didn't diminish theirs. But I was increasingly aware of how my family used these comparisons to maintain their preferred narrative about what constituted a meaningful life. As the evening wore on, I found myself slipping back into familiar patterns despite my resolution to maintain emotional distance. The warmth of family connection, the comfort of shared history, the genuine affection that existed beneath all the misunderstandings and miscommunications. These people had raised me, supported me through childhood challenges, celebrated my early achievements even if they had failed to appreciate my later ones. Was I about to destroy all of that for the sake of making a point about respect and recognition? I excused myself to use the bathroom and took a moment to look at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked calm and composed, professional and successful. But I could see uncertainty in her eyes, the internal conflict between love and justice, between family loyalty and personal dignity. My phone buzzed with a text message from David Morrison. Due diligence complete. Numbers check out. Ready to proceed with acquisition offer at your signal. The message crystallized my resolve. This wasn't just about personal feelings anymore. Rodriguez Construction was genuinely struggling, and without intervention, my father would lose everything within 6 months. My acquisition offer represented the best possible outcome for everyone involved, even if the power dynamics would be dramatically different afterward. When I returned to the living room, Claire was showing my parents photos from their recent anniversary trip to Napa Valley. Beautiful pictures of vineyards and restaurants. The kind of carefully curated vacation that looked perfect on social media, but revealed nothing about the underlying relationship. "Maya, you should come with us next time," Claire said. "You work so hard, you deserve a real vacation." The assumption that I didn't take vacations, that my life was all work and no pleasure, was another example of how little they actually knew about my current circumstances. In the past year, I had traveled to Japan for cherry blossom season, spent 2 weeks hiking in Patagonia, and taken a wine tour through Burgundy that had been far more extensive and expensive than Claire's Napa trip. But I had learned to share these experiences selectively, if at all, because they always seemed to generate more questions and judgment than celebration. "Maybe," I said noncommittally. As the evening wound down, everyone began to yawn and check their phones. Brad had an early meeting tomorrow. Claire needed to review some marketing materials. My parents were showing their age more than they used to. It was a natural ending to a pleasant family dinner, the kind of evening that might have been perfectly satisfying under different circumstances. "This was wonderful," I said, as I gathered my purse and prepared to call an Uber back to my hotel. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was perfect, as always." "You're not staying here tonight?" my father asked, seeming surprised. "I have some business calls to make tomorrow morning," I explained. "Pacific time zone meetings. It's easier from the hotel." This was partially true. I did have calls scheduled with David Morrison and the legal team to finalize the acquisition. Documents. But mainly, I needed space to prepare for tomorrow evening's conversation, to practice what I would say and how I would say it. "What kind of business?" Claire asked curiously. "Investment opportunities," I said vaguely. "Due diligence calls, that sort of thing." My father nodded approvingly. "Smart to diversify after your company sale. Put that money to work." If only he knew how I was planning to put it to work. The Uber ride back to Manhattan gave me 45 minutes to think about the evening's conversations and what they revealed about my family's current situation. My father was clearly under more stress than he was letting on, but he was maintaining his optimistic facade. Claire seemed genuinely unaware of any serious problems with the company. My mother was focused on her usual concerns about my personal life and seemed to view my business success as interesting, but ultimately secondary to finding a husband and starting a family. In other words, nothing had fundamentally changed. They were still the same people with the same priorities and the same blind spots that had characterized our relationships for years. The difference was that I was no longer the same person trying to fit into their expectations. Back in my hotel room, I spread out the acquisition documents and reviewed them one final time. The offer was fair, arguably generous given Rodriguez Construction's current financial position. The terms would allow my father to maintain his role as operational manager while transferring ultimate decision-making authority to me. The price would pay off the company's debts and provide working capital for the next 18 months. Most importantly, the structure would save the jobs of all current employees, including Claire and Brad. No one would lose their livelihood because of this acquisition. In fact, with proper management and capital injection, the company could grow beyond its current size and create additional employment opportunities. This wasn't a hostile takeover. This was a rescue mission disguised as a family dinner conversation. But as I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the image of my father's face when he realized what was happening. The man who had built Rodriguez Construction from nothing, who took pride in being his own boss, who valued independence above almost everything else. Tomorrow evening, he would learn that his independence was now subject to his daughter's approval. Was I saving him or breaking him? The answer, I suspected, would depend entirely on how he chose to respond to the new reality. Some people adapted to changed circumstances with grace and wisdom. Others fought against them until they destroyed themselves. My father was proud, stubborn, and unaccustomed to answering to anyone. But he was also practical, intelligent, and ultimately motivated by love for his family. Tomorrow evening would reveal which of these characteristics was stronger. I fell asleep thinking about the conversation we would have, imagining different scenarios and outcomes. In some versions, my father accepted the new arrangement with gratitude and relief, recognizing that I was offering him a lifeline. In others, he exploded with anger and indignation, viewing my intervention as betrayal rather than salvation. But in all versions, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. By tomorrow night, Maya Rodriguez would own Rodriguez Construction and Development. The daughter who had been forgotten at the airport would become the woman who controlled her family's future. And we would all learn to live with the consequences of that transformation. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning to 17 missed calls from David Morrison. My phone had been on silent, and seeing his name repeated across my lock screen sent an immediate jolt of adrenaline through my system. Either something had gone catastrophically wrong with the acquisition, or something had developed that required immediate attention. I called him back while still in bed, my voice rough from sleep. "David, what's happening?" "Maya, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for 3 hours. We have a situation." My stomach dropped. "What kind of situation?" "Your father's company. They're in worse shape than even your analysis suggested. My team found some additional liabilities that weren't in the public filings. Subcontractor disputes, pending litigation, tax issues. The acquisition is still viable, but we need to restructure the offer." I sat up in bed, fully awake now. "How much worse?" "Instead of 6 months until bankruptcy, they have maybe 6 weeks. 8 at the outside. Maya, if we don't move fast, there won't be anything left to acquire." The irony wasn't lost on me. While I had been sitting through pleasant family dinner conversation, listening to my father talk about legacy work and strong client relationships, his company had been circling the drain even faster than I had realized. "What do you need from me?" I asked, already reaching for my laptop. "I need you to get me internal access. Financial records, contracts, employee agreements, everything that's not in the public filings. We can make this work, but only if we know exactly what we're dealing with." This created a new problem. Getting internal access to Rodriguez Construction's records would require either breaking into their offices, which was illegal, or getting cooperation from someone inside the company. And the only people with that kind of access were my family members. "How much time do we have?" "The offer needs to be on the table by Monday morning, or we risk having other creditors force an involuntary bankruptcy filing. Today is Thursday. We have 4 days. 4 days to acquire complete financial records, restructure an acquisition offer, and present it to my family in a way that didn't result in permanent relationship damage. It was an aggressive timeline even under normal circumstances, and these were far from normal circumstances. "I'll figure out the access issue," I told David. "Send me a list of exactly what documents you need." After we hung up, I sat in the hotel room's plush chair, looking out at the Manhattan skyline as the sun rose over the East River. The situation had just become significantly more complex. What had started as a strategic acquisition to assert control over family dynamics had evolved into a genuine rescue mission with a ticking clock. My phone buzzed with David's email, containing a comprehensive list of financial documents, contracts, and records needed to complete the due diligence. Reading through the requirements, I realized there was only one realistic way to get this information quickly enough to meet our deadline. I would have to tell Claire. My sister worked in Rodriguez Construction's marketing department, but as the owner's daughter, she had access to far more than her job title would normally allow. She could get me everything David needed, assuming I could convince her to help without revealing the full scope of what I was planning. I spent 2 hours crafting the perfect approach, running through different scenarios and conversation strategies. Claire was smart, but not particularly suspicious, trusting, but not naive. If I presented this correctly, she would help me get the information while believing she was assisting with a potential investment rather than facilitating a hostile acquisition. At 8 o'clock, I called her cell phone. "Maya, you're up early." Claire's voice was cheerful but surprised. "Everything okay?" "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Are you free for coffee this morning? Before work?" "Of course. Is everything all right?" "You sound serious." "Everything's fine. I just have a business opportunity I wanted to discuss with you. Something that might benefit the family." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown White Plains, halfway between her house and the Rodriguez construction offices. I chose the location carefully, somewhere public enough to feel safe, but private enough for sensitive conversation. Claire arrived exactly on time, looking polished and professional in a burgundy blazer and black slacks. She hugged me warmly and immediately launched into apologies about the airport situation, clearly still feeling guilty about yesterday's mix-up. "Claire, forget about the airport," I said as we settled into a corner booth with our coffee. "I need to talk to you about Dad's company." Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "What about it?" "I've been looking into construction companies as potential investments, and Rodriguez Construction keeps coming up in my research. The problem is, most of my information is coming from public sources, and those don't tell the whole story about a company's real financial health." Claire nodded slowly, clearly unsure where this conversation was heading. "What I need," I continued, "is someone who understands the industry and has access to internal information. Someone who could help me evaluate whether this would be a good investment opportunity." "You want to invest in Dad's company?" Claire's voice carried a mixture of surprise and excitement. "I'm considering it, but I need to do proper due diligence first. I can't make investment decisions based on family loyalty alone." This was technically true, though I was deliberately omitting the part about already having made the decision to acquire the company outright. "Maya, that would be incredible. Dad's been working so hard, and I know he's been stressed about some of the bigger projects. Having you as an investor would solve so many problems." The eagerness in Claire's voice told me everything I needed to know about how much she understood regarding the company's real situation. She knew things were challenging, but she had no idea how close to catastrophe they actually were. "The thing is," I said carefully, "I need to review the actual financial records, revenue, expenses, outstanding contracts, pending litigation, everything that would give me a complete picture of the company's position." Claire's expression became thoughtful. "I could probably get you some of that information. I mean, I don't have access to everything, but Dad trusts me with a lot of the business details." "How much access do you actually have?" "More than you might think. I handle all the marketing, which means I know about current projects, client relationships, upcoming bids. And Dad often asks me to help with administrative stuff because Mom handles a lot of the bookkeeping from home." This was better than I had hoped. Between Claire's legitimate access and my mother's involvement in the company's financial administration, I could potentially get everything David needed without having to involve my father directly. "Here's what I'm thinking," I said, pulling out my phone to show her David's list. "I have an investment advisor who specializes in construction companies. He's put together a list of documents he needs to evaluate any potential investment. If you could help me get these materials, I could have a preliminary assessment done by early next week." Claire looked at the list, her eyebrows rising as she read through the comprehensive requirements. "This is really detailed. Your investment advisor doesn't mess around. When you're talking about a multi-million-dollar investment, you can't afford to miss anything, I replied. The more thorough the analysis, the better offer I can make. Multi-million-dollar investment? Claire's voice went up an octave. Maya, how much money did you make when you sold your company? I had been expecting this question and had prepared a carefully vague response. Enough to make serious investments in companies I believe in. But Claire, I need you to understand something. This has to stay between us until I've completed my analysis. I don't want Dad getting his hopes up if the numbers don't work out. This was crucial. I needed Claire's help, but I couldn't have her running to our father with news that his daughter was considering a major investment. That conversation needed to happen on my timeline, with my framing. Of course, Claire agreed immediately. Dad's been so worried about everything lately. The last thing I want to do is give him false hope. So she did understand that there were serious problems, even if she didn't grasp the full extent of them. How worried should I be? I asked gently. Is the company in real trouble or just going through a rough patch? Claire's expression became genuinely troubled. I think it's more serious than Dad wants to admit. There have been a lot of closed-door conversations with the accountant, and I've heard him on the phone with the bank multiple times. Last week, he asked me to delay some of our marketing payments to vendors. Delaying vendor payments was a classic sign of cash flow problems. If Rodriguez Construction was struggling to pay for basic services like marketing, their situation was even more dire than my analysis had suggested. Claire, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think Dad would lose the company if things don't turn around soon? My sister was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. I think he might, she whispered. Maya, he's put everything into this company. It's not just his business, it's his identity. If he loses it. She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew our father well enough to understand what losing Rodriguez Construction would do to him. Roberto Rodriguez was the kind of man who defined himself through his work, his ability to provide for his family, his reputation in the community. Bankruptcy wouldn't just be a financial setback for him, it would be a complete destruction of his sense of self-worth. Then we need to make sure that doesn't happen, I said firmly. Will you help me get the information I need? Claire nodded. Emphatically. Yes, absolutely. What do you need me to do? We spent the next hour going through David's document list, item by item. Claire identified which materials she could access directly, which ones would require my mother's help, and which ones might need to come from my father's personal files. It was a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation disguised as family assistance. I can get most of this by Friday afternoon, Claire said, clearly energized by having a concrete way to help solve the family's problems. Maya, I can't tell you how much this means to me, to all of us. Dad's been trying so hard to handle everything himself, but he's just one person. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Claire was enthusiastically helping me acquire the documents I needed to take control of her father's company, believing she was facilitating an investment that would save it. In a sense, she was right. But the ultimate outcome would be very different from what she was imagining. After we parted ways, I spent the rest of the morning in my hotel room, coordinating with David's team and preparing for the next phase of the operation. The legal documents were being drafted, the financing was being arranged, and the timeline was being compressed to accommodate the company's accelerating financial crisis. By lunchtime, I had confirmed that Morrison & Associates could have a complete acquisition offer ready by Sunday evening, assuming we received all the necessary documentation by Friday. The offer would be structured as a rescue acquisition, allowing Rodriguez Construction to avoid bankruptcy while transferring ownership to my investment group. My father would wake up Monday morning as an employee of a company he had built from nothing. But he would wake up employed rather than filing for bankruptcy. I was scheduled to have dinner with my family again that evening, and I found myself dreading the conversation more than I had expected. Last night's dinner had been pleasant precisely because it was built on incomplete information and false assumptions. Tonight would be different. Tonight, I would be sitting across from my father knowing exactly how close he was to losing everything, while he continued to maintain his facade of competent control. The afternoon passed slowly as I reviewed construction industry reports and prepared talking points for the evening's conversation. I needed to gather additional intelligence about specific projects and client relationships without arousing suspicion. It was a delicate balance between appearing interested and seeming intrusive. At 6 o'clock, I took an Uber back to Westchester, watching the familiar suburban landscape pass by while mentally rehearsing different conversation scenarios. The driver, a talkative man named Ahmed, tried to engage me in discussion about the local construction boom, apparently having overheard me mention Rodriguez Construction during a phone call with David. "Oh, you know Rodriguez Construction?" Ahmed asked enthusiastically. "Good company. They built my nephew's apartment complex. Very professional, very reliable." "What makes you say that?" I asked, genuinely curious about the company's reputation from a customer perspective. "They finish on time, they don't cut corners, and when there are problems, they fix them without arguing. In this business, that's rare. Most construction companies, you have to fight them for everything." This reinforced what I already knew about Rodriguez Construction's operational strengths. The company's problems weren't related to quality or customer service. They were purely financial, the result of taking on projects that were too large relative to their capital resources, and making pricing decisions that prioritized winning contracts over maintaining healthy profit margins. When I arrived at my parents' house, I could immediately sense a different energy than the previous evening. There was tension in the air, a barely perceptible undercurrent of stress that hadn't been present during last night's reunion dinner. My mother greeted me at the door, but her usual warmth seemed forced. "Maya, sweetheart, come in. Your father's been on business calls all afternoon." Business calls on a Thursday evening were another red flag. Healthy companies didn't require their owners to conduct crisis management conversations during family time. In the living room, I found my father sitting in his favorite chair with a stack of papers on his lap and his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when I entered, and I could see the strain around his eyes despite his welcoming smile. "There's my successful daughter," he said, rising to give me a hug. "Sorry about the paperwork, just trying to stay on top of a few projects." "Dad, you don't need to apologize for working," I said. "I understand how demanding business can be." But as I spoke, I noticed the papers he had been reviewing. They appeared to be legal documents, and I caught glimpses of phrases like payment schedule modification and contract renegotiation before he gathered them up and set them aside. Claire arrived shortly after me, followed by Brad, who seemed unusually subdued. During our coffee meeting that morning, Claire had mentioned that Brad's big presentation hadn't gone as well as he had hoped. Apparently, the Morrison account had decided to go with a different agency, a setback that had deflated his earlier enthusiasm. Dinner conversation was more stilted than it had been the previous evening. My father made an effort to maintain his usual gregarious demeanor, but I could see the effort it required. My mother seemed preoccupied, frequently glancing at her husband with worried expressions. Claire was clearly thinking about our morning conversation and the documents she had promised to gather. "Maya," my father said as we worked through my mother's excellent chicken mole, "Claire mentioned you might be interested in learning more about the construction business." I shot a quick glance at Claire, who looked slightly guilty. We had agreed to keep my investment interest confidential, but apparently she hadn't been able to resist sharing at least part of our conversation. "I'm always interested in learning about different industries," I replied carefully, "especially ones with strong fundamentals and growth potential." "Construction can be rewarding," my father said, "but it's not for everyone. It requires patience, attention to detail, and the ability to manage complex projects with lots of moving parts. Sounds similar to technology development, I observed. Multiple teams, interdependent timelines, budget constraints. I suppose there are some similarities, he acknowledged. Though in construction, when something goes wrong, you can't just release a software patch to fix it. Everything is permanent. As the evening progressed, I found opportunities to ask about specific aspects of the business: client relationships, project management challenges, competitive pressures. My father answered readily, clearly enjoying the chance to discuss his work with someone who seemed genuinely interested. But the more he talked, the more evident it became that he was describing a company in serious trouble. Projects that had gone over budget, clients who were disputing charges, subcontractors who were demanding faster payment, suppliers who were requiring cash on delivery instead of extending credit terms. Each detail painted a picture of a business in financial distress, even though my father presented them as routine challenges that every construction company faced. The market is definitely more competitive now than it was 10 years ago, he admitted as we moved to the living room for coffee. Everyone's fighting for the same projects, which drives down profit margins. You have to be really careful about which jobs you take on. Have you had to turn down projects because the profit margins weren't adequate? I asked. My father's expression darkened slightly. Sometimes you take projects that are marginal because you need to keep your crews working. Idle workers are expensive workers. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten Rodriguez Construction into trouble. Taking on low-margin projects to maintain cash flow was a strategy that worked in the short term but created long-term problems, especially when those projects encountered unexpected costs or delays. What about when projects go over budget? I pressed gently. How do you handle cost overruns? It depends on the contract structure, he replied. Some contracts have built-in protections for unforeseen circumstances. Others put all the risk on the contractor. You try to negotiate fair terms, but sometimes you have to accept terms that aren't ideal in order to win the work. In other words, Rodriguez Construction had been accepting contracts that exposed them to significant financial risk, gambling that they could complete projects on budget despite having limited control over external factors that could drive up costs. As the evening wound down, I felt a growing sense of urgency about moving forward with the acquisition. My father was clearly under enormous stress, trying to maintain a confident facade while his company crumbled around him. Every day of delay increased the risk that other creditors would force a bankruptcy filing that would eliminate any chance of a rescue acquisition. But I also felt a deep sadness about what was coming. Tomorrow evening, I would sit in this same living room and tell my father that his daughter was taking control of his life's work. The man who had spent 25 years building something from nothing would learn that his independence was now subject to his child's approval. It was the right decision from a business perspective, and probably the only decision that could save Rodriguez Construction. But it would fundamentally alter our relationship in ways that might never be repaired. As I prepared to leave, my father walked me to the door. "Maya," he said quietly, "I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. Selling your company for serious money at your age, that's incredible. You've got a bright future ahead of you." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten with emotion. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot coming from you." "Just remember," he continued, "success in business is about more than just making money. It's about building something that lasts, something that makes a difference in people's lives. You keep that in mind as you think about your next steps." If only he knew what my next steps actually were. The Uber ride back to Manhattan gave me time to process the evening's conversations and steel myself for what was coming. Tomorrow, Claire would deliver the documents David needed to finalize the acquisition offer. This weekend, we would structure the deal and prepare the legal paperwork. Monday evening, I would present my family with a choice between accepting my buyout offer or watching Rodriguez Construction collapse into bankruptcy. By Tuesday morning, I would own my father's company. The thought should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like preparation for surgery. Necessary, beneficial in the long run, but undeniably painful for everyone involved. Friday morning arrived with an email from Claire that changed everything. She had worked through the night to gather the documents David needed, but what she had discovered in the process had shaken her to her core. "Maya," her message read, "we need to talk immediately. What I found in Dad's files is worse than either of us imagined. Can you meet me at the office? I'll be here early, before anyone else arrives." I was dressed and in a taxi within 15 minutes, my heart pounding as I tried to imagine what Claire might have uncovered. The urgency in her message suggested something beyond the financial problems I already knew about. Rodriguez Construction's offices occupied the second floor of a modest building in White Plains, a space that reflected my father's practical approach to business expenses. No marble lobbies or executive suites, just functional workspace designed to house the administrative side of a working construction company. Claire met me at the front door, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her eyes red from lack of sleep. She looked like someone who had spent the night confronting uncomfortable truths about people she loved. "Thank God you're here," she said, pulling me inside and locking the door behind us. "Maya, I don't know what to do with what I found." She led me to the conference room where she had spread out dozens of documents across the long table. Financial statements, contracts, legal correspondence, bank records. It looked like the aftermath of a document explosion. Papers organized into piles that told the story of a company in complete financial collapse. I started with the list your investment. "Advisor wanted," Claire began, her voice shaky. But as I was pulling files, I kept finding things that didn't make sense. Discrepancies between what Dad has been telling us and what the actual records show. She handed me a folder marked Riverside Commons Project in my father's handwriting. "This is the big job Dad mentioned, the one that's been running over budget. Maya, we're not talking about a small cost overrun. We're talking about a disaster." I opened the folder and immediately understood why Claire looked so shaken. The Riverside Commons project had been contracted for $4, $2 million, but the actual costs had ballooned to more than $7 million. Rodriguez Construction was absorbing a $3 million loss on a single project, enough to bankrupt most companies of their size. "How is this even possible?" I asked, scanning through the documentation. Environmental problems that weren't disclosed in the original site survey," Claire explained. "Contaminated soil that had to be remediated before construction could begin. Then the city changed the building codes midway through the project, requiring structural modifications that weren't in the original design. Dad thought he could absorb the extra costs and still make a profit on the back end, but the client is refusing to pay for the modifications," I finished, reading through the legal correspondence. "They're claiming the contamination should have been discovered during the initial survey, so it's our responsibility to handle the remediation costs. Dad's been fighting them for 8 months, spending money on lawyers while the project sits unfinished." This single project explained why Rodriguez Construction was hemorrhaging cash at an accelerated rate. Not only were they losing money on the work already completed, but they were continuing to incur legal expenses while the project remained in limbo. Claire handed me another folder, this one even thicker than the first. The Harrison Heights project. Another disaster, different reasons. This contract had been for a luxury residential development, 43 custom homes in an upscale suburb. On paper, it should have been highly profitable. But the client had declared bankruptcy midway through construction, leaving Rodriguez Construction with partially completed houses, unpaid invoices totaling $8 million, and no legal recourse for recovery. Dad kept both of these projects going with company money, hoping he could find solutions, Claire said. But Maya, there are no solutions. He's throwing good money after bad, and he's too proud to admit it. I continued reading through the files, each document painting a more dire picture than the last. Rodriguez Construction wasn't just facing cash flow problems. They were facing a perfect storm of project failures, legal disputes, and financial obligations that had pushed them far beyond the point where a simple capital injection could solve their problems. "Claire, does Dad know that you know about all of this?" She shook her head. "He's been hiding the worst of it from everyone, including Mom. The bank statements I found were in a locked file cabinet in his office. I had to use the emergency key he gave me years ago." "What about Brad? Does he know how bad things are?" "Brad only sees the project management side. Dad's been protecting him from the financial details, just like he's been protecting all of us." As I continued reviewing the documents, a clearer picture emerged of what had happened to Rodriguez Construction. My father had made the classic mistake of trying to solve cash flow problems by taking on larger and more complex projects, assuming that higher revenues would offset temporary losses. Instead, the larger projects had exposed the company to risks they weren't equipped to handle, creating losses that compounded with each successive failure. "There's something else," Claire said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Something I found in Dad's personal files." She handed me a letter from the Internal Revenue Service, dated 3 weeks ago. Rodriguez Construction owed more than $800,000 in back payroll taxes, with penalties and interest accumulating daily. The IRS had placed a lien on all company assets and was threatening to begin seizure proceedings within 30 days. "Claire, this means the company could be shut down at any time," I said, feeling a chill run through me. "If the IRS moves forward with asset seizure, there won't be anything left to acquire or save." "I know," she whispered, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "Maya, Dad's been carrying all of this alone. He gets up every morning and pretends everything is fine, that he's just dealing with normal business challenges. But he's been living with the knowledge that he could lose everything he's built any day now." The magnitude of my father's stress became suddenly, painfully clear. Roberto Rodriguez hadn't just been managing typical construction industry challenges. He had been fighting a desperate, likely hopeless battle to save his company while maintaining a facade of confidence for his family and employees. Every cheerful conversation about business challenges, every optimistic comment about weathering difficult markets, every assertion that Rodriguez Construction had strong fundamentals had been delivered by a man who knew he was probably weeks away from complete financial collapse. "We have to help him," Claire said urgently. "Maya, your investment opportunity? Can you move fast enough to stop this from happening?" I looked at my sister, her face streaked with tears and desperation, and realized that the conversation I had planned for Monday evening could no longer wait. The timeline had compressed beyond what I had anticipated. If the IRS was threatening asset seizure within 30 days, and other creditors were likely to follow similar timelines, I had to act immediately. "Claire, I need to tell you something. About my investment plans. It's more complicated than I initially explained." For the next hour, I walked my sister through the reality of what I was proposing. Not a minority investment in Rodriguez Construction, but a complete acquisition that would transfer ownership from our father to my investment group. A rescue operation that would save the company and its employees, but would fundamentally alter the family power structure. Claire's initial reaction was shock, then confusion, then a growing understanding of what such an arrangement would mean for everyone involved. "You would own Dad's company?" she asked, still processing the implications. "I would control it, yes. Your father would transition from owner to senior manager, reporting to me. You and Brad would keep your positions, but your ultimate boss would be me instead of Dad. And you have the money to actually do this? To pay off all these debts and make the company profitable again?" I pulled out my phone and showed her my banking app, watching her eyes widen as she processed the 9-figure balance. "Maya, How much money did you actually make when you sold your company? $127 million, more than enough to acquire Rodriguez Construction, pay off all its debts, and provide working capital for expansion. Claire stared at the phone screen in stunned silence, then looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not admiration or excitement, but something closer to awe mixed with concern. You've been sitting on this much money while Dad's been suffering through all of this, while our family's been falling apart financially? The accusation in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that I had miscalculated how Claire would react to learning about my wealth in the context of our father's crisis. Claire, I didn't know how bad things were until I started investigating the company as a potential investment. Dad has been hiding the extent of the problems from everyone, including me. But you could have helped months ago if you had just asked the right questions. This was the moral complexity I had been trying to avoid. Yes, I could have prevented my father's crisis if I had been more proactive about understanding his situation, but I also hadn't been given any indication that such intervention was necessary or wanted. You're right, I admitted. I could have and should have been more involved in understanding the family business. But Claire, I can't change the past. I can only address the current situation. And right now, my acquisition offer is probably the only thing that can save Rodriguez Construction. We were interrupted by the sound of someone entering the office. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see my father walking through the reception area, clearly surprised to find the lights on and the door unlocked. Claire, are you here? My sister looked at me with panic in her eyes. He wasn't supposed to be in this early. Maya, what do? We tell him the truth, I said, gathering up the financial documents. All of it. He's going to find out about your research anyway, and he deserves to know that there's a solution available. My father appeared in the conference room doorway, taking in the scene of scattered documents and his daughters huddled in crisis conversation. His expression shifted from confusion to concern to something that looked like resignation. I see you've discovered my little accounting problem, he said quietly, walking into the room and sitting down heavily in one of the chairs. Dad? Claire began. I'm sorry. I was trying to help Maya with some research, and I found... You? Found out that your old man has made a mess of everything, he finished. How much do you know? I decided that directness was the only viable approach. We know about Riverside Commons, Harrison Heights, the tax liens, and the IRS seizure timeline. Dad, why didn't you tell us how serious this was? Roberto Rodriguez looked older than I had ever seen him, the weight of months of stress and sleepless nights suddenly visible in his posture and expression. What was I supposed to say? That I took the company your grandfather helped me start and destroyed it through bad decisions and worse luck? That I borrowed against everything we owned to cover losses on projects that should have made us rich? That your mother might lose the house because I was too proud and too stupid to walk away from deals that were killing us? The raw pain in his voice cut through all my carefully planned conversations and strategic considerations. This wasn't a business transaction anymore. This was a family crisis that had been festering in isolation while the rest of us went about our normal lives. Dad, you should have trusted us enough to ask for help, Claire said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Help with what? You think I haven't considered every possible solution? I've talked to every bank in the county, every private lender, every potential investor I could find. Nobody wants to touch a construction company that's losing money on every major project. What about family? I asked quietly. Did you consider asking your family for help? My father looked at me with an expression that was equal parts love and frustration. Maya, you're 28 years old with a computer science degree. I wasn't going to burden you with my business problems. And your mother and Claire, they depend on me to handle these things. It's my job to protect this family, not the other way around. But what if I could help? I asked. What if I had resources you don't know about? What kind of resources could you possibly have that would make a difference in this situation? I pulled out my phone and showed him the same banking app screen I had shown Claire. The kind of resources that come from selling a technology company for 9 figures. My father stared at the phone screen for a long time, his expression cycling through disbelief, shock, confusion, and something that might have been hope. Maya, this number. This is real? This is your money? It's real, Dad. I sold Nexus Analytics 6 weeks ago for $127 million. I've been looking for investment opportunities, and Rodriguez Construction is exactly the kind of company I want to get involved with. You want to invest in my company? There was something almost heartbreaking about the hope in his voice. I want to acquire your company, I corrected gently. Dad, the problems you're facing are too big for a partial investment. You need a complete restructuring, new management, and enough capital to weather the current storms while building sustainable profitability. The hope in his expression died as he processed what I was actually proposing. You want to buy me out? I want to save the company and preserve the jobs of everyone who works here, including yours. But yes, that would mean transferring ownership to my investment group. My father was quiet for several minutes, staring at the financial documents spread across the conference table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I built this company from nothing. 25 years of 16-hour days, missed family dinners, weekends spent on construction sites. Everything I've accomplished, everything I am, is tied up in Rodriguez Construction. And it can continue to be, I said. You would still be involved in running the company, still making the day-to-day decisions about projects and personnel. The only difference is that the ultimate financial responsibility would transfer to me. The difference is that I would be working for my daughter instead of working for myself. There it was, the core issue that I had known would be the most difficult to navigate. My father's identity was built around being an independent business owner, a man who answered to no one and controlled his own destiny. Becoming an employee, even of his own daughter's company, represented a fundamental loss of the autonomy that defined him. Dad, Claire interjected, maybe that's not such a terrible thing. You've been carrying all this stress alone, making all these difficult decisions by yourself. Having Maya involved would mean you'd have support, both financial and strategic. Support, he repeated bitterly. You mean supervision? I mean partnership, I said firmly. Dad, I don't want to micromanage Rodriguez Construction. I want to provide the financial stability that allows you to focus on what you do best, which is delivering quality construction projects. You would still be the operational leader of the company, but not the owner. No, not the owner. My father stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where his truck sat beside Claire's car. His truck had Rodriguez Construction logos on both doors, a mobile advertisement for the company he had built and was now facing the prospect of losing. What happens to the employees? He asked without turning around. Everyone keeps their jobs. In fact, with proper capitalization, we could probably expand and create additional employment opportunities. And Claire and Brad? They continue in their current roles, with the same reporting structure they have now. Reporting to me, who reports to you? Yes. He turned around to face me, and I could see that he was struggling with emotions. I couldn't fully understand. Pride, gratitude, resentment, relief, all warring for dominance in his expression. How would this work, practically speaking? What would the transition look like? I opened my briefcase and pulled out the preliminary acquisition documents that David Morrison's team had prepared. We've structured it as an asset purchase rather than a stock sale, which protects you from most of the company's existing liabilities. You would receive payment for the company's tangible assets, and my group would assume responsibility for the debts and ongoing operations. My father took the documents and began reading through them, his eyebrows rising as he processed the financial terms. Maya, this offer is generous, more than generous. It's more money than the company is actually worth in its current Condition. I'm not buying the company in its current condition. I'm buying its potential under proper management and adequate capitalization. And you think I'm capable of that proper management, even reporting to you? This was the crucial moment, the question that would determine whether my family saw this acquisition as salvation or humiliation. Dad, you're one of the most capable people I know. You built Rodriguez Construction from nothing into a company with an excellent reputation and strong client relationships. The problems you're facing now aren't the result of incompetence. They're the result of taking risks in a challenging market without adequate financial backing. Remove the financial constraints, and you're perfectly capable of running a profitable construction company. But under your oversight, under my financial backing, there's a difference. Claire, who had been listening to this exchange with growing tension, finally spoke up. Dad, what's the alternative? If Maya doesn't make this offer, what happens to Rodriguez Construction? My father sat back down, suddenly looking exhausted. The alternative is that we lose everything. The IRS seizes our assets, our creditors, force us into bankruptcy, and I spend the next 10 years paying off personal guarantees on loans that will never be recovered. And Mom loses the house? Claire asked quietly. Mom loses the house, he confirmed, along with everything else. We've built over the past 25 years. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of difficult choices and unwanted realities. My father stared at the acquisition documents, reading through terms that would save his company while fundamentally altering his relationship with it. Maya, he said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Is this offer motivated by business considerations or by family loyalty? Because if you're doing this just to bail out, your old man, I'm not sure I can accept it. The question was more complex than he realized, because the truth was that my motivations were a mixture of both. Yes, I wanted to save my father from financial ruin because I loved him. But yes, I also saw genuine business potential in Rodriguez Construction under proper management. It's both, I said honestly. I love you and I don't want to see you lose everything you've worked for. But Dad, I'm also a businesswoman who doesn't make 9-figure investments based on sentiment alone. Rodriguez Construction has real value that can be unlocked with proper financial backing and strategic oversight. And you think you can provide that oversight despite having no experience in the construction industry? I think I can provide financial management and strategic planning, while you continue to provide operational expertise and industry knowledge. It would be a partnership that plays to both of our strengths. My father was quiet for a long time, occasionally glancing back at the documents in front of him. Finally, he looked up at both Claire and me. I need to discuss this with your mother before I can give you an answer. Of course, I agreed. But Dad, given the IRS timeline, I need a decision by Sunday evening. The legal and financial processes will take several days to complete, and we can't afford any delays. Sunday evening, he repeated. That's 2 days to decide whether to hand over my life's work to my daughter. 2 days to decide whether to save your life's work with your daughter's help, I corrected. As we prepared to leave the office, my father asked one final question. Maya, will you be moving back to New York to oversee the company? I'll be spending significant time here, but I can manage most of the financial and strategic aspects remotely. The day-to-day operations would continue to be your responsibility. He nodded slowly, then looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You know, when you were growing up, I always knew you were special. Smarter than the rest of us, more ambitious, more capable. I just never imagined that someday you'd be in a position to save me from my own mistakes. Dad, you didn't make mistakes. You took risks that didn't work out. There's a difference. Is there? Or is that just what successful people tell themselves to sleep better at night? As we walked out of the office together, I realized that the dynamic between us had already shifted in ways that couldn't be reversed. Whether my father accepted my acquisition offer or not, he now knew that his daughter had more financial resources than he did, more business success than he had achieved, and the ability to solve problems he couldn't solve himself. The father-daughter relationship we had maintained for 28 years, built on his role as provider and protector, had been permanently altered by the morning's revelations. Sunday evening couldn't come soon enough, and couldn't come slowly enough. Saturday morning brought an unexpected phone call from my mother at 7:30 a.m. Her voice was strained, carrying an emotional weight I hadn't heard since my grandfather's funeral 5 years earlier. "Maya, Mija, can you come to the house? Your father told me everything last night and we need to talk as a family." I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the kind that comes from spending an entire night processing information that fundamentally changes your understanding of your life and relationships. "Of course, Mom. I'll be there in an hour." "And Maya? Bring those papers your father was looking at yesterday. We need to understand exactly what you're proposing." The drive to Westchester gave me time to prepare for what was likely to be the most difficult conversation in our family's history. My parents had spent their entire marriage building a life around my father's role as provider and decision-maker. Learning that their youngest daughter now had the financial resources to control their future represented a seismic shift in family dynamics that went far beyond simple business arrangements. I found both my parents in the kitchen, sitting at the breakfast table with untouched coffee cups and expressions that suggested they had been awake most of the night. My mother's usual morning routine of preparation and presentation had been abandoned. She was still in her robe, her graying hair uncombed, looking older and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. My father appeared equally exhausted, but there was something different in his demeanor. The desperate stress that had characterized his recent behavior had been replaced by a kind of resigned determination, as if he had finally accepted the reality of his situation and was prepared to deal with its implications. "Maya," my mother said as I sat down at the table, "your father has explained the company's financial problems and your proposal to help, but I need to hear it from you. I need to understand what this would mean for our family." For the next 2 hours, I walked them through every aspect of the acquisition proposal: the financial terms, the operational structure, the employment arrangements, the timeline for implementation. I answered their questions about my own wealth, explaining how Nexus Analytics had grown from a small startup into a technology platform used by major corporations worldwide. My mother listened with the focused attention she had always brought to important family discussions, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly absorbing information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her daughter's life and capabilities. "So when you sold your company," she said slowly, "you made more money than your father has earned in his entire career." "Yes, Mom, significantly more. And you've been sitting on this information for 6 weeks while we've been worried about the business." "I didn't know you were worried about the business. Dad has been presenting everything as routine challenges rather than existential threats." My father nodded grimly. "Because I was hoping I could solve the problems without involving the family. I was trying to protect everyone from the stress I was carrying." "But that protection kept us from being able to help," my mother pointed out. "If we had known how serious things were, we could have had this conversation months ago." This was exactly the kind of family dysfunction that had contributed to the current crisis. My father's desire to shield his family from business problems had prevented them from offering support or alternative perspectives that might have led to earlier solutions. Meanwhile, my own tendency toward privacy about my professional success had kept me from understanding the extent of their difficulties. "Mom," I said gently, "I want you to understand that regardless of what Dad decides about the acquisition, nothing fundamental has to change about our family relationships. I'm still your daughter, Dad is still my father, and this house is still my childhood home. But everything has changed. she replied sadly. Maya, you're offering to buy your father's company, to become his boss. How can family relationships stay the same when the power dynamics have shifted so dramatically? It was a question I had been avoiding, but one that deserved an honest answer. They can't stay exactly the same, I admitted. But they can evolve into something different that still honors our connections and our love for each other. Mom, successful families adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their core bonds. And unsuccessful families? My father asked quietly. Unsuccessful families let pride and resentment destroy relationships that should be more important than business arrangements. My mother reached across the table to take both my father's hand and mine, creating a physical connection that bridged the emotional complexity of our situation. Roberto, she said to my father, what do you want to do? My father was quiet. For several minutes, staring at our joined hands while processing the most difficult decision of his professional life. I want to save the company, he said finally. I want to protect the jobs of the people who have worked for me, some of them, for more than 10 years. I want to avoid bankruptcy and the personal guarantees that would destroy our retirement and your security. He paused, then looked directly at me. But Maya, I need to know that you understand what you're taking on. Rodriguez Construction isn't just a financial investment for you. It's going to become part of your professional responsibility, part of your reputation, part of your life in ways that might be more complicated than you anticipate. I understand, Dad. I've spent the last 6 weeks studying the construction industry, analyzing your company's operations, and developing strategies for sustainable profitability. This isn't an impulse decision based on family sentiment. And you're prepared for the possibility that working together might strain our personal relationship? I'm prepared to work hard to make sure that doesn't happen. But Dad, if the alternative is watching you lose everything you've built, then yes, I'm willing to accept that risk. My mother squeezed both our hands tighter. Then we accept your offer, she said simply. We accept it with gratitude and with faith that our family is strong enough to handle whatever challenges this brings. My father nodded slowly, then looked at me with an expression that contained both defeat and relief. Maya, I accept your acquisition offer. Rodriguez Construction will become part of your business portfolio, and I will transition from owner to senior manager, reporting to you. The words hung in the air between us, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. My father would wake up Monday morning as an employee of a company he had built from nothing, but he would wake up employed rather than facing bankruptcy and financial ruin. There are some practical arrangements we need to discuss, I said, pulling out the legal documents David Morrison's team had prepared. The transition process, the new reporting structure, the employee communications. We spent the rest of the morning working through the details of what would happen over the next week. Monday, David Morrison would present the formal acquisition offer to Rodriguez Construction's board, which consisted of my father and my mother as the company's 2 stockholders. Tuesday, assuming their acceptance, the legal paperwork would be filed and the financial transfers would begin. Wednesday, we would meet with the company's employees to explain the ownership transition and assure them about job security. By Friday, Maya Rodriguez would officially own Rodriguez Construction and Development. What about Claire and Brad? My mother asked as we reviewed the employee retention plans. They continue in their current positions with no changes to their responsibilities or compensation, I assured her. The only difference is that their ultimate reporting structure will include me as the company's owner. Have you told them about Dad's decision? Not yet. I thought we should handle the family conversation first, then bring Claire and Brad into the discussion. My father, who had been reviewing the acquisition documents while my mother and I talked through practical arrangements, looked up with an expression of surprise. Maya, these financial terms are even more generous than what we discussed yesterday. You're paying more for the company than it's worth even before accounting for the current liabilities. I'm paying for its potential under proper management, not its current distressed condition. Dad, Rodriguez Construction has an excellent reputation, strong client relationships, and experienced employees. Those assets are worth more than the current financial statements suggest. But you're also assuming responsibility for more than $3 million in problematic project costs, plus the tax lines and other debts. This acquisition is going to cost you significantly more than the purchase price. I can afford it, I said simply. And more importantly, the company can be profitable again once these legacy issues are resolved and we have adequate working capital. My mother, who had been listening to this exchange with growing emotion, suddenly started crying. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked, alarmed by her sudden tears. "Nothing's wrong," she said through her sobs. "Everything's right. Maya, do you realize what you're doing? You're not just saving your father's company. You're saving our house, our retirement, our whole future. And you're doing it because you love us, even though we've never fully appreciated what you've accomplished." The raw gratitude in her voice was almost overwhelming. My mother, who had spent years subtly criticizing my career choices and lifestyle decisions, was finally understanding the magnitude of what I had built and what I was now offering to share with my family. "Mom, you don't need to thank me. This is what families do for each other. No, mija. This is what exceptional daughters do for families who haven't always recognized their worth." My father, clearly struggling with his own emotions, stood up and walked to the window overlooking their backyard. The yard where I had played as a child, where we had held birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where my parents had planned to spend their retirement years tending a garden and enjoying the fruits of my father's decades of hard work. "Maya," he said without turning around, "I need you to know that accepting your help doesn't diminish my gratitude or my recognition of what an extraordinary thing you're doing. But it's also one of the hardest things I've ever had to do." "I know, Dad. Do you? Do you really understand what it means for a man to accept financial rescue from his child? To go from being the family provider to being dependent on his daughter's success?" I joined him at the window, looking out at the yard that held so many memories of our family's history. "Dad, you're not becoming dependent on my success. You're becoming part of it. Rodriguez Construction isn't going to be a charity case that I support out of family obligation. It's going to be a profitable business that contributes to my overall investment portfolio. And if it doesn't become profitable, if I can't turn the company around even with your financial backing, then we'll figure out how to make it work together. Dad, I'm not investing in Rodriguez Construction despite your involvement. I'm investing in it because of your involvement. You have 25 years of experience in this industry, relationships with clients and suppliers, knowledge about local market conditions that I could never replicate." He turned away from the window to face me directly. "Maya, I want you to promise me something." "What?" "If working together becomes too difficult, if the family dynamics start affecting business decisions or business pressures start damaging our personal relationship, you'll tell me. You won't let loyalty or sentiment prevent you from making the hard choices necessary to protect your investment." "Dad, I promise. But I also promise to work as hard as I can to make sure we never reach that point." We were interrupted by the sound of Claire's car in the driveway. Through the window, I could see her and Brad getting out, both looking tense and uncertain. Clearly, they had been anticipating this family meeting with considerable anxiety. "Should we tell them together?" my mother asked. "I think that would be best," I agreed. Claire and Brad entered the house with the cautious demeanor of people who weren't sure what kind of news they were about to receive. Claire hugged both my parents, then looked at me with an expression that was equal parts hope and fear. "So," she said carefully, "have you made a decision about the investment?" "We've made a decision about the acquisition," my father corrected. Maya is going to buy Rodriguez Construction. The silence that followed lasted several seconds as Claire and Brad processed this information and its implications. Buy the company? Brad repeated. Like, own it completely? Like, own it completely, I confirmed. Your positions remain the same. Your job security actually improves and the company gets the financial stability it needs to grow and prosper. Claire sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, clearly trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. So Maya becomes our boss, she said slowly. Maya becomes the company owner, my father clarified. I remain your direct supervisor for day-to-day operations. But yes, ultimately she becomes our boss. And this is happening because the company was in more trouble than any of us realized, Claire continued, working through the logic of the situation. This is happening because I love this family, and I have the resources to help solve a serious problem, I said. Claire, I know this changes things between us, but it doesn't have to change them in bad ways. Brad, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. Maya, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Are you doing this to help the family, or are you doing this because you want to control the family business? The question was more perceptive than I had expected from Brad, and it deserved an honest answer. I'm doing it for both reasons, I said. I want to help the family avoid financial disaster, and I also see a genuine business opportunity in Rodriguez Construction. But Brad, if I wanted to control a construction company for purely business reasons, I could buy one that doesn't come with complicated family dynamics. The family aspect makes this more challenging, not easier. So we should be grateful that you're willing to take on those complications? There was an edge to his voice that suggested some resentment about the changing power dynamics. You should be realistic about what the alternatives are, I replied calmly. If I don't make this acquisition, Rodriguez Construction declares bankruptcy within 6 weeks. Everyone loses their jobs, Dad loses everything he's built, and the family faces financial ruin. If I do make this acquisition, everyone keeps their jobs, the company gets the resources it needs to be successful, and the family's financial security is protected. But we all become your employees. You all become employees of a profitable, stable company instead of a failing one. Claire, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, intervened. Brad, Maya is offering to save our jobs and Dad's company. Why are you questioning her motives? Because I want to understand what we're getting into, he replied. Yesterday, Maya was the successful sister who sold her company. Today, she's our boss with the power to fire us if she doesn't like our performance. That's a big change. My father, clearly sensing the potential for this conversation to deteriorate into family conflict, stepped in with his authoritative voice. Brad, Maya is offering to invest millions of dollars to save a company that would otherwise fail. She's taking on significant financial risk and responsibility to protect our livelihoods. If you have concerns about the arrangement, express them respectfully, but don't question the generosity of what she's doing. I'm not questioning her generosity, Brad said defensively. I'm trying to understand the practical implications of working for a family member who now has complete control over our professional lives. It was a legitimate concern, one that I had been thinking about extensively. Brad, you're right that this changes the family dynamics in ways that could be challenging. But here's what I can promise you. Your employment will be based on your professional performance, not on family politics. If you do your job well, you'll be valued and secure regardless of any personal disagreements we might have. If you don't do your job well, there will be consequences, just like there would be in any professional environment. And if we have family disagreements that affect our working relationship, then we'll handle them like adults, with clear separation between family issues and business issues. It won't always be easy, but it's not impossible if everyone commits to making it work. Claire, who had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration, finally exploded. "Brad, for God's sake, Maya is saving our family from financial disaster and you're worried about reporting structures? Do you understand what would happen to us if she doesn't do this?" "I understand," he said quietly. "I just want to make sure we're all being honest about how complicated this is going to be." He was right, of course. The arrangement I was proposing would create ongoing challenges that would require careful navigation and considerable maturity from everyone involved. But the alternatives were so much worse that these complications seemed manageable by comparison. "Brad's concerns are valid," I acknowledged. "This is going to be complicated, and we're all going to have to work hard to make it successful. But I believe we can do it, and I believe the benefits outweigh the challenges." My mother, who had been quietly observing this family discussion, made an observation that put everything in perspective. "You know, when your father and I got married, people warned us about the challenges of working together in the same business. Roberto had just started Rodriguez Construction, and I was handling the bookkeeping and administrative work. Everyone said it was a mistake to mix business and family relationships." She paused, looking around the kitchen that had been the center of our family life for more than 20 years. "But working together made us stronger, not weaker. We learned to separate business decisions from personal feelings, to support each other through professional challenges, and to celebrate our shared successes. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it." "This situation is different, Mom," Claire pointed out. "You and Dad were equal partners. Maya is going to own the company." "The ownership structure is different," my mother agreed, "but the fundamental challenge is the same. We have to choose whether we're going to let business arrangements strengthen our family bonds or damage them." My father, who had been listening to this conversation with growing determination, made a statement that surprised everyone. "I want to say something to all of you. Maya's acquisition of Rodriguez Construction isn't a failure on my part or a diminishment of our family's independence. It's a gift that allows us to preserve everything we've built while adding new resources and opportunities we couldn't access on our own." He looked directly at me. "Maya, I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm grateful for what you're offering to do. But more than that, I'm excited about the possibility of working together to build something even better than what I could have achieved alone. Dad, that means everything to me. And Brad," my father continued, turning to his son-in-law, "Maya isn't taking over Rodriguez Construction to control us. She's taking it over to save it. If you can't embrace that reality and commit to making this partnership work, then you need to decide whether this is the right company for you." Brad nodded slowly, clearly recognizing that his continued employment would depend on his ability to adapt to the new structure. "You're right," he said. "Maya, I apologize for questioning your motives. I'm grateful for what you're doing, and I'm committed to making this work." "Thank you, Brad. I appreciate that." The conversation continued for another hour as we worked through practical details and addressed remaining concerns. By early afternoon, we had reached a family consensus about moving forward with the acquisition. Monday morning, David Morrison would formally present the offer. By the end of the week, Rodriguez Construction would have new ownership and a secure future. As Claire and Brad prepared to leave, my sister pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Maya, I need to ask you something personal." "What? Are you happy? With everything you've accomplished, all the money you've made, all the success you've achieved, are you actually happy?" The question caught me off guard, perhaps because it was the first time anyone in my family had asked about my personal satisfaction, rather than my professional achievements. "Yes," I said after thinking about it carefully. "I am happy. Not because of the money, but because I've been able to build something meaningful, and now I'm able to use that success to help people I love." "I'm proud of you," Claire said, tears forming in her eyes. "I know I haven't always been the most supportive sister, but I'm proud of what you've become and grateful for what you're doing. Claire, you've always been supportive in your own way. We just express support differently. Maybe. But from now on, I want to do better. I want to really understand your work, your goals, your life, not just the parts that intersect with family concerns. I'd like that. After Claire and Brad left, I spent another hour with my parents, going over final details and preparing for the week ahead. As the afternoon sun slanted through their kitchen windows, I found myself thinking about how much had changed since my flight had landed at JFK just 3 days earlier. Thursday evening, I had been the forgotten daughter, abandoned at the airport while my family prioritized other concerns. Sunday afternoon, I was the family's financial savior, the daughter whose success had become the foundation for their security and future growth. But more than the external circumstances had changed. The family dynamics that had characterized our relationships for decades had been fundamentally altered. No longer would my parents view me as the impractical dreamer who needed guidance toward more conventional success. No longer would my professional achievements be dismissed or minimized in favor of my siblings' more traditional accomplishments. Instead, I had become the family member whose decisions would shape everyone else's future, whose success would determine their opportunities, whose vision would guide the business that employed them all. It was a responsibility I hadn't sought, but one I was prepared to embrace. As I prepared to leave for Manhattan that evening, my father walked me to the door. "Maya," he said, "I want you to know that whatever challenges we face in the coming months, I'm grateful we'll be facing them together." "Me too, Dad. And I want you to know that regardless of the business arrangements, you'll always be my daughter first and my boss second. That's exactly how I want it to be." He hugged me tightly, and for the first time in years, I felt like we understood each other completely. The Uber ride back to Manhattan gave me time to process everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. Monday morning, I would become the owner of a construction company I had never worked for, responsible for the livelihoods of people I had never met, committed to the success of an industry I was still learning about. But I would also become a bridge between my family's history and their future, a connection between my father's decades of experience and the resources necessary to build on that foundation. My phone buzzed with a text message from David Morrison. "Legal documents finalized. Ready to proceed Monday morning. Congratulations on saving the family business." I smiled as I typed my response. "Thanks. Looking forward to building something even better." As the taxi crossed the Queensboro Bridge and the Manhattan skyline came into view, I thought about the conversation I would have with James when I returned to San Francisco. How do you explain to someone that you've just acquired your father's failing company and fundamentally altered your family's power structure in the span of a single weekend? The answer, I realized, was that you explain it as an investment in the people you love and the relationships that matter most to you. Money, even lots of money, was ultimately just a tool for creating the kind of life and the kind of family you wanted to have. I had used that tool to build a successful technology company. Now I was using it to rebuild my family's financial security and create new possibilities for our future together. Thursday morning at JFK, I had been Maya Rodriguez, the overlooked daughter whose family had forgotten to pick her up at the airport. Sunday evening, I was Maya Rodriguez, the woman who had spent her taxi ride home buying her family's company and securing their future. It had been an expensive taxi ride, but worth every penny. 6 months later, Rodriguez Construction had completed both the Riverside Commons and Harrison Heights projects profitably, hired 12 new employees, and secured its largest contract in company history. My father had adapted to his new role with surprising grace, appreciating the financial stability that allowed him to focus on construction rather than crisis management. Claire had proven to be an excellent marketing director with adequate resources to support her strategies. Brad had risen to the challenge of increased responsibility and expanded project management duties. Most importantly, Our family dinners had resumed their weekly schedule, with conversations that included genuine interest in everyone's professional accomplishments and personal goals. I never did use that Starbucks gift card from my graduation celebration. Instead, I had it framed and hung in my new office at Rodriguez Construction, a reminder that recognition is something you give yourself long before others are ready to acknowledge your worth. And I never forgot the lesson learned. During that long taxi ride from JFK to Manhattan, sometimes the best revenge is success shared generously with the people who underestimated you. The airport had been the beginning of my story, but my family's dining room table had been its true conclusion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.